I am Becky Kremp, Director of the Daviess County Museum. Welcome to this virtual field trip. In case you've never visited our museum at 212 East Main in Washington, this is what the front of the building looks like. The building was built in 1868 and is a piece of history on its own. All throughout Daviess County there are landmarks that were created and maintained by our ancestors here. Landmarks that can help us understand how people in the past worked, studied, traveled, and lived their lives. In this video, with the help of some expert guides, we're going to take you to a few of these special places to tell you their stories. Without further fanfare, let's go to the map of Daviess County and see where we'll be visiting first.
We're here in Odon, Indiana, at the log cabin in the Odon Park, and I'm joined by
David Smith.
Dave. And we're going to talk a little bit about this building and where it comes from. Can you give us a little bit of an introduction as to what the origins of this site are and how it came to be?
Yes, this cabin was originally a church north of Odon, out by Farland, and it was had deteriorated to a point where it was no longer being used as a church. It was built in about 1880, early 1880s. And so whenever they decided they wasn't going to use it anymore, Reverend from here in Odon decided that he would like to have it and rebuild it on this site here in the park and use it for a scout cabin. So the scouts used this log cabin for many years. Most of the logs are about 12 inches by 12 inches. Some of them are 10, but most of them 10 or 12 inches. These are not the original logs. When they brought it in, they had to replace some of them. And then again in the 1960s, it was renovated again by a local CB club, and a lot of the logs again had deteriorated to a point where they need to be replaced. The cabin is approximately 24 feet by 30 feet, and again, last summer, we completely renovated the inside. The floor had fallen out, and so we put a new flooring in it, and it's now ready to be rented for different activities. Okay, the inside of the building, the flooring joists had fallen down to the ground. We thought that everything had rotted out under there, but after we got inside, we found out that they were never attached to the logs on the side. And so the water came underneath and they were just sitting on some boards and they had washed out. So we took the floor halfway up and thought we would refinish it. But as we got towards the center of the floor, we found out it wasn't capable of being refinished. So we bought new yellow poplar lumber and made all new flooring. And we had a crew from the jail come in and they done all the labor at no charge, and then other local people have chipped in. They donated lots of material for new ceilings, lighting, and so forth. So it's ready to go. Well, to our knowledge, it still has the original fireplace in it, and it's all built out of stone. We don't use it anymore because the insurance company's afraid of it, but I believe it's as sound today as it was when it was built. And my wife, Bev Smith, she has completely cleaned that fireplace and painted it and made it just look like brand new. Right, these logs were all hand hewn back then. There wasn't modern day saws and so forth. So it was all, the joints where it goes together on the corners will all be done by an axe or a hand-drawn type of equipment. And again, most of these logs would have been poplar. Sometimes they would put an oak log in, but I believe that whenever we had it renovated, we used poplar logs to do that with. And then of course in the joints, we use concrete today, and back then they did not have concrete to use to fill in these joints. So they had other materials that they used. The log cabin was actually moved to this location in 1885. So that's the earliest date that we've been able to find on that.
Hello. Earlier, we took you on a trip to the northeastern corner of Daviess County to Odon, Indiana, to visit the historic log cabin. That cabin was built in the 1800s as a church. Later, when it wasn't used as a church anymore, the people of Odon moved it to the town park where it remains today. Today we are back in the Daviess County Museum to view the Boy Scouts replica or copy of that same log cabin. We aren't sure exactly when the replica was built by the Odon Boy Scouts, but sometime in the 1920s. For years, this copy lived inside the real log cabin at the Odon Park, along with many tools that were actually used by pioneers in this area. In the 1980s, the Town Board of Odon donated the log cabin replica and most of the tools that are on exhibit at this museum. Who were these pioneers? With wagons loaded to start a new life, the earliest settlers arrived in what is now Daviess County, mainly from the south, sometime between 1801 and 1812, with names like William Ballou, Eli Hawkins, John Thompson, David Flora, Richard Palmer, and others. They brought tools to clear the forests, build cabins, and plant food crops. Chisel-edged broadaxe, hatchet, saw, adze, scythe, chisel, froe, F-R-O-E, for shingles and barrel staves, planes, and mauls. Once these families arrived, they used the basic tools to fashion the tools they didn't have room for in the wagon. Leaving the comfort of home for a new life on the frontier in the Midwest was very different than moving from one house to another today. The pioneers who constructed the western borders had to be self-supporting, and that meant they had to take everything they needed with them. They packed their wagons to capacity, and it wasn't unusual to come across wagons propped up on barrels or crates on the side of the road while the owner repaired a split axle or broken wheel. How did they make those repairs? That meant they had to carry the tools needed with them in the wagon. The key to a successful journey was being self-sufficient. They not only had to be able to repair and make things they needed, then they had to be able to constantly find food as they traveled. And what did that require? Tools for trapping and dressing wild animals they ate. One of the main types of tools needed for this was a hunting knife worn on the belt. Other types of knives were needed for dressing wild game. We do have hand-carved wooden bowls used to mix bread, heavy cast-iron cooking pots that hung over an open fire, a cast-iron fry pot, metal candle molds, and many other types of things. Wooden butter churns. Let's say the pioneers arrive at a place they think would be a good homestead. Then what? They should have tools with them to harvest the natural resources like trees in order to turn these trees into raw materials like logs to create their homes. So what were some of these tools? A frontier toolkit would have several sizes of hammers, ranging from the claw hammer to heavier ones used for metalwork or crushing stones and rocks. And when the real power was needed for sinking posts, something called a maul, M-A-U-L, was needed. The museum has on display a solid hickory maul carved out of one hickory tree, donated by county historian Don Cosby. This maul was used by his ancestors to sink fence posts, as well as to drive shingle froes, which is a type of a wedge, in order to make shakes or shingles out of cedar blocks. It is very heavy and was made out of a single piece of wood. Hanging on the wagon in the exhibit are several different types of tools also. The wagon, by the way, is probably more dated from early 1900. rather than early 1800. Hammers, saws, axes, these were all crucial for building shelter. Most homes on the frontier were constructed from wood, though some were made using sod. Spades or shovels were essential for all types of digging, from everything from creating root cellars to planting vegetables, and even used to bury the dead. Farming was survival to the pioneers, so plows, hoes, flails, and scythes were critical. Some scythes had long handles, some had short handles. On the side of the wagon is a long-handled, solid hickory-handled scythe. Inside the home, tools were important as well. Spinning wheels were very common, as wool or cotton was spun to create fibers for making into blankets, clothing, and other fabrics. Women had to have a grinding device to make flour from the grain. The smallest and simplest tool every woman used was the humble needle. Nobody had new or repaired clothing unless it was made by hand. Additionally, sewing skills from scratch were needed for blankets, leatherwork, flour and grain storage bags, and even blankets for horses. These are just a few samples of tools the pioneers needed for life on the frontier. We take so much in life for granted today in 2021. While we have every type of tool for every type of job available to us today, is life easier or simpler? Or is it more complex? The next time you pick up a pair of scissors or any other tool, even the basic screwdriver, stop and give a thought to those who came before you, those pioneers who settled the lands in early 1800, the lands that became Indiana and Daviess County.
Hello, my name is Jane Colbert Gillooly. Today we're in Veal Township, approximately 5 miles south of Washington, Indiana, along Highway 57. The structure that you see here is currently known as the Veal Creek Theater, but it was constructed in the late 1800s for an elementary school known as Lett School. It was one of a number of one-room schools in this area. This building accommodated students in grades 1 through 4, with approximately 8 to 10 students per grade. And Scudder School, a couple of miles east of here, was for grades 5 through 8. I attended both of these schools in the 1950s. I needed to ride the bus to Lett School, but I lived close enough to Scudder to walk, and I could go home for lunch. This building that you see here is only one of 2 remaining of those early elementary schools. The current Veal School was built in 1960 after I started to Washington High, and going there was quite a shock after spending 8 years in a one-room school. At the time I started school, there was no pre-K or kindergarten. We simply enrolled in first grade when we turned 6. The advantage of having 4 grades together in one room was that if you missed learning about something the first or second grade, you could catch up the next 2 to 3 years. The building itself has undergone major changes over the years, so it doesn't much resemble the schoolhouse that many of us remember. So you will have to use your imagination as I describe it to you. In front of the double-doored entry was a large set of concrete steps where the girls would often spend recess playing jacks or pickup sticks or hopscotch in front of the steps. Of course, there was no gymnasium, so the boys and some of the braver girls would play ball, called rounders, or play tag or Red Rover on the playground behind the school. Since indoor plumbing was not available, The girls' outhouse was situated on the far northeast end of the playground, and the boys' was on the southeast side. I remember one day Mrs. Barber chasing one of the boys to the outhouse with a paddle in her hand. There was a large bell on a tower outside the narrow side door. The teacher would sometimes let us take turns ringing the bell to call students in from recess or from lunch. We had a morning recess and a short one in the afternoon. There was a water well on the property where we got our drinking water. It was kept in a large galvanized container in the coat room. The big boys would take turns pumping the water. One very cold day, one of the boys dared another to put his tongue on the metal pump handle. That was a big mistake. His tongue stuck to that freezing handle. Now, I don't recall how he got unstuck, but I do remember he was crying. The bigger boys also carried in the buckets of coal from a shed behind the school. The coal was used to heat the classroom on winter days. If you sat near that pot-bellied stove, you were too warm. But if you sat too far away, you would need to leave your coat on if it was very cold outside. As you entered the building from the front, you would first go to the left or to the right through the coat room where you hung sweaters and jackets and left your lunch buckets. The only way you had a hot lunch those days was if it had been set too close to the stove in the back of the classroom. A blackboard, some big maps, and the American flag took up the whole front wall, with the teacher's desk in front of that. There was handy access to a couple of switches and a paddle. Those were to be used on any unruly student, and thankfully, I never experienced that. My favorite spot in the whole room was the big bookcase full of all kinds of wonderful books. As soon as I learned to read, then reading became my passion. I later spent 19 years working in a bookstore. The bookshelves were under the broad, high windows on the north side of the classroom, along with an old upright piano. Once or twice a month, Mamie Gaither would come and play for us to sing. She let us pick any song we wanted, and then she'd play them by heart. We loved music days. It was a great break from spelling, writing, and arithmetic lessons. The wood plank floors in the room were oiled during summer break and swept every day, but it was sure hard to keep our clothes clean between the oily floor and the ashes from the coal stove. Every morning after attendance was taken, we would stand and recite the Pledge of Allegiance, and Mrs. Barber would encourage us to follow the golden rule, which of course was, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And sometimes we would say the Lord's Prayer together. I'm left-handed, so my first grade teacher, Miss Jones, asked my mother when I started school if she should try to make me use my right hand. That was common thinking at that time. But my mother said no. If God had wanted her to be right-handed, he would have made her that way. So I'm still a lefty. As you can tell, many things were much simpler then, some were not. I do feel very blessed to have experienced those early school years. I have many fond memories of this place, and some of my dearest friends yet today are ones that I learned with and played with at our Lett School. And I would like to close by sharing a poem that was written by my great-grandma Morgan when I started to first grade. She's gone to school, our Janie, so Tiny just turned 6. And oh, the house is empty, the clock, how loud it ticks. No laughter in the garden, no swinging on the gate, just quietness and order, and a fire upon the grate. She's gone to school, our Janie, in brand new pinafore, to learn the art of letters and dip in ancient lore. So eager for the future and sturdy for her size, but oh, the heart grows weary before the head is wise. She's gone to school, our Janie, so sweet and unafraid, her toes in shiny slippers, her hair up in a braid. And here, where she's been so happy, a little prayer I'll pray. God bless all the little Janies gone to school today. Love, Grandma Morgan.
Hello, I am Miss Ann, and I'm your teacher today. I'm here in the one-room schoolhouse inside the museum, and I'm going to teach you some history. One of the first of the schoolhouses in Daviess County was in 1811. But we didn't get a lot of schoolhouses until we became a state in 1817. They ruled that we could get some money for it, but nobody had any tax money. About 1850, they finally had some tax money, and they started giving it to the counties to do schools. Until then, most of the schools were run privately. We had people either donated houses that they no longer lived in, or the churches donated their church for the schools to be used during the day. The school teachers were men, and they either had other jobs or they lived with family. They went on like this until the Civil War in the 1860s. We sent over 2,200 men into battle during the Civil War, and there was a shortage on teachers. So at that time, women were finally allowed to teach. You had to have an 8th grade education. You had to have a diploma that showed that you passed 8th grade. And then you could teach. Now, a teacher who's a female could not live in her own house. She had to live with their students. So this week I'm going to live with Johnny. Next week though, I'm living with Sally. And the week after that, I think maybe I'll go over here to Ezra. So a female teacher did not have anything that was her own but her clothes. And she had to be very plain. She could not go out and talk to men. She could only go to church, to school, and home. Now, after the Civil War in the 1880s, we had more people coming and settling in Daviess County, and we then had another influx. During the 1880s, we had so many one-room schoolhouses. We had over 112 just here in Daviess County. They were so close because the children had to walk. Nobody had a horse or a wagon that they could use just for that. The children, when they came, the oldest had to get logs and start the fire, or else we were cold. Someone else had to bring in water, either through a pump or out of the river. Outhouses were outside. The first schools were only in the winter, from November to the end of February. It wasn't until the 1880s when the state decided to make it all pretty much the same that we started going a little bit longer and in the early 1900s, it is then set up to be pretty much the school year that we have now. Discipline was fun. The teacher walked around with a stick. She would get you if you weren't behaving. The other things were the paddle, which everybody knows about. Some of the other fun ones were a girl with her long hair would have her hair pulled up and pegged up on the wall, and she had to stand that way. A boy really had to get dressed in girls' clothes and wear dresses all day. Those are just some of the other disciplines to make sure everyone in school was listening. Now the first schools, because again, remember, no money. There was no chalkboard, there was no paper, there was very few books. So the teacher would tell them what to recite, and everybody recited at one time. That is the Babel. And if anybody can remember, we had a famous president who was taught that way, Mr. Abraham Lincoln. The other way was they would have to recite something out of a book. Now, if their parents were rich enough and had a book of their own, they could recite out of that. Otherwise, most of them were out of the Bible because everyone had a Bible. And when we started getting books in the 1880s, when we had more money, then we would have books that then we would pass around and everybody would recite out of that. The cost of going to school was between 5 cents a week to about 10 cents a week per child. That is all the teacher got paid. Again, until the 1880s, until it was an established rate. So, that is some of our history. I hope you've learned between looking at what it was and some of the history of how we got here. If you want more information, please come to the museum and see our one-room schoolhouse.
Okay, we're out here at Ebenezer Cemetery, and this is very far south of Washington, almost on the county line. And I'm standing here with Monty Critchlow, who is a board member at the Daviess County Museum and also part of the Civil War Roundtable here in Daviess County. And we're standing at a historical marker for the burial site of Captain Eli McCarty. Now we're going to ask Monty if he can tell us a little bit about who is Captain Eli McCarty and why does he have this historical marker out here?
During the Civil War, the nation needed volunteers to fight against the Southern armies. So Eli McCarty, a resident of Washington, raised a company of 80 men, organized them as Company G of the 42nd Indiana, and participated in the Battle of Perryville, Kentucky. During that battle, Captain McCarty was wounded in the shoulder and disabled, but instead of retiring and going back to civilian life, McCarty stayed in the Army and became a draft recruiter. That was a person who served notices to civilians in order for them to join the Army. Daviess County was very much a participant in the war effort for the Union. Governor Morton was very pleased with Daviess County. They were only one of 2 counties to fulfill all the draft quotas that were given to each county. However, Daviess County was also the home of a lot of Southern sympathizers, people that favored the Confederacy in the Civil War simply because they migrated from the South to the Barr and Reeve townships. A lot of them settled near Alfordsville, and that's where McCarty was delivering his draft notices. And therefore, to a certain family he delivered them to, the Slicer family. They had 2 sons that were to be drafted, and they threatened McCarty when he delivered the notices. McCarty stopped at the William Jackson home for dinner, and at that time, Jackson warned McCarty not to go further, but to stay all night with him because there were people in the area that wished to kill him. But McCarty wanted to get back home, so he set alone on his horse, headed toward Washington, and was ambushed by 7 men, shot him off of his horse, killed him instantly, drug his body to the White River, and dropped it with stones so that it wouldn't be found. When McCarty didn't return home to Washington, a search party was organized and found the body due to an informant who kind of knew what had gone on, and they found the body right away. Search party arrested 5 men. 3 of them fled west and joined a outlaw gang. Those 5 people were brought to justice, but only served 6 years in prison. And so McCarty is buried here at Ebenezer Cemetery in a simple stone, but this marker remembers what a hero he was in dying for his country.
If you come down to visit us at the Daviess County Museum on Main Street in Washington, we have a number of artifacts and exhibits also related to the Civil War. You can learn about some of the thousands of Daviess Countyans who participated in the war through stories and letters home from the battlefield, and other items and artifacts that we have on display.
Behind me is a site that most people in Daviess County are very familiar with, and that is the intersection of Interstate 69 and Highway 50 on the east side of Washington, Indiana. As we all know, millions of dollars was spent to develop a 4-lane interstate highway from Evansville, Indiana, and eventually to Indianapolis, Indiana. We call that type of transportation project these days infrastructure. And the idea behind spending that kind of money is very simple. If you improve your transportation system, you can more effectively and faster transport goods, produce, and people from one place to the other. And when you improve your transportation system, the concept is that will create prosperity. There will be greater business opportunities, business growth, commercial and retail growth, population growth, and prosperity. What is fascinating about Daviess County is one of the earliest and probably one of the most audacious and ambitious government-financed transportation projects occurred right here in Daviess County, almost 170 years ago, and that was the Wabash and Erie Canal. When the canal was completed in 1853, it stretched 460 miles from Toledo, Ohio at Lake Erie all the way to Evansville, Indiana on the Ohio River. It was the longest canal ever built in the United States. It was the second longest canal built in the entire world. It was an engineering marvel. It was magnificent. But when it was finally completed in 1853, the entire operation only lasted 7 years, and it was a complete, huge financial disaster. We are standing in what was formerly the Wabash and Erie Canal. And you can see that along Highway 57 between Plainville and Elnora to the west. What happened is that in 1836, the Indiana General Assembly decided that they were going to dramatically improve the transportation system in Indiana. You need to remember that Indiana became a state in 1816, and except for a few settlements along the Ohio River in southern Indiana, the rest of the state was essentially wilderness, a very thick forest full of old, large trees. And the only way that you could really travel, transport goods and people, was on rivers. There were a few trails through the wilderness, but there were certainly no roads. Highway 57 wasn't here, the railroads weren't here, I-69 certainly wasn't here. So the concept in 1836 from the Indiana General Assembly was we're going to dramatically improve the transportation system in Indiana, the infrastructure project. In order to build this canal, they didn't have, back in those days, bulldozers, backhoes, any type of heavy equipment. It was all manual labor. And so what they did, this private company, is they intentionally immigrated thousands of poor Irish immigrants that come into Daviess County to build this canal. And it resulted in a large segment of the Irish population now in Daviess County. So this is the remnants of the Wabash and Erie Canal. Again, this was all hand dug by these laborers, these Irish laborers. The canal was basically, at the top of the canal, it was 40 feet wide. The sides of the canal sloped down, as you can still see, and at the bottom of the canal, it was approximately 20 feet wide. The depth of the water in the canal was approximately 4 feet. And the water came from water that was diverted from the White River, which is about a mile to the west of us. So they diverted water from the river into this canal after it was dug, hand dug, by these Irish laborers. It took them approximately 3 years to finish the section between Worthington in Greene County down to Maysville, and that was called the Maysville Division. Once the canal was completed, then they had wooden canal boats that floated in this 4 feet of water. These were wooden boats. They were about 15 feet wide and about 90 feet long. How were these boats moved? They didn't have engines. They didn't have motors. And how they were moved was the dirt that was dug out of the canal was then put up on what was called a towpath. And that towpath was just directly to the west of the canal. And on that towpath that runs parallel to the canal, they would have anywhere from 1 to 2 or 3 horses that would be hitched by a long rope to these canal boats. And these horses would literally pull these canal boats the entire length of the Erie Canal for 460 miles. The entire Wabash and Erie Canal from Toledo, Ohio to Evansville opened in 1853. And the first canal boat that made the entire trip from Toledo to Evansville docked in Evansville in September of 1853, and the name of that boat was the Pennsylvania. The era of the Wabash and Erie Canal was extremely short. By 1860, it was obvious that this was an incredibly unprofitable venture. And the reason was that because the railroad had come in. They began to build extensive railroads, including one that went through Washington, Indiana. The railroad system that relied on steam engines was much more efficient, it was faster, and could move people and produce and goods much more effectively. The Wabash and Erie Canal was never profitable. It always lost money. And by 1860, this section of the Wabash and Erie Canal in the southern part of Indiana basically shut down. All right, we're standing next to Highway 57, just on the outskirts of Elnor, Indiana. And behind me is the historical marker that has been placed here by the Indiana Highway Department about the Wabash and Erie Canal. And across Highway 57 behind me, you can see the remnants again of the Wabash and Erie Canal. It just looks like a very large overgrown ditch, and behind the ditch, behind the former canal, is the towpath on which railroad tracks have been constructed. But Elnora was not Elnora between 1853 and 1860. The town at that time was known as Owl Prairie, and it was a major stopping point for folks traveling on the Wabash and Erie Canal. We're standing here on what appears to be a railroad track, and it is, of course. But this is this area, and you can see it going in that direction. It's heading north. This railroad track was built on the towpath that was used by the Wabash and Erie Canal. This particular railroad track today is currently owned what's called the Indiana Southern Railroad, and basically it hauls exclusively either coal, corn, or soybeans on what was formerly the towpath for the Wabash and Erie Canal.
Okay, we're standing out here at the Round Barn here south of Washington, and we're going to talk a little bit about this unique landmark here in Daviess County. And who am I talking to right now?
It's me, Ward.
Well, Ward, can you tell us about this building? Do you know who built it and when it was built?
It was built by my great-great-grandfather, Thomas Singleton, in 1908.
Now, as people can see from this building, it's round. Can you tell people why it was built round?
Well, the round barn is round because it made it so you could lead a horse completely around it and not have to take any corners.
Can you show me a couple of unique features of this barn that you think people would be interested in knowing about?
Yeah. This right here is a very old toy. It was attached to a tool, and people lowered it down to get loose hay off of this wagon behind me. And then right here, this black thing is called a louver.
Louver.
It's designed so that the air can get through, but the rain can't.
So are there a lot of people that are interested in this place? Why do you think that there are so many people that are interested in this place?
Well, there was a whole lot of people that are interested in this place because a lot of times I see people pull up into our driveway to take pictures of our barn. Yeah. And then one time I went to a summer camp called Camp Hilliana, and there was a gift shop there, and at the gift shop there was either a picture or there was a picture of the round barn or a painting.
Okay, very good. Well, thanks for talking with us today, Ward, and thank you for explaining about the history of this building.
One more thing.
Okay.
When Indiana celebrated its bicentennial anniversary, this barn was in the top 10 barns And so it's called the Bicentennial Barn.
Okay, well, thank you for joining us today, and I hope everybody has enjoyed watching us out here at the Round Barn.
Goodbye. I hope to see you again.
Okay, I'm here in Offordsville, Indiana, at the gas station in Offordsville, and I'm talking to Eric Andrews and Alfred Helms. And this gas station, and this is an old gas station. Can you tell me a little bit about how it was built, when it was built, and who owned it, and all the rest of that? Can you tell me a little bit about the history of the building here?
Okay. The best I know, there was a fellow that built the building. His name was Tang Burris. And that Tang was a slang name, if you'd have it that way. And I guess he ran it a number of years, and I don't know what happened to him or why it sold or anything, but there was a lot of different guys, or quite a few different fellows that owned it. And it was really a gathering place of the people around. Fellows came here and shot the bull and whatever. And they had this thing that they'd ask them what they were doing. They said, well, we're waiting on the bus, waiting on the work bus. And it just ain't got here yet. And so anyway, I myself at that time thought about buying the station. I was preaching at the church here beside of it. And I talked to them about buying it. But actually they sold it to Gerald Harder. Bought it, and Gerald ran it for quite a few years, but it just sat here for a period of maybe 8 years or so. And it deteriorated quite a bit. It had a leak in the roof, a big hole rotted in the floor here in different places. But I bought the station, and so I took over, and I put some trusses in the ceiling here to hold the ceiling up, and redone the roof, or repainted the roof a couple of times, and repaired all the floors, painted the walls, and built shelves all in it. And this character here tore them all out. and so I had it for 4 years. I bought it in 17 and ran it until early this year. And so I only opened it up because I wanted the people here in town to have a store, and also that they could buy gas here in town. So I ran it until this guy came along, and of course I opened it up actually just to get it going again and hopefully to sell it to somebody. And it was Eric. I asked him how he was getting along, and a few days later, or probably a few weeks later, he said he was living a dream. That he really, I guess he dreamed of owning a little store like this.
So the building actually was built in 1935.
Right?
Is when I found the paperwork.
Okay.
And this was the actual store part, was built in 1935, which has a basement underneath it.
That's right.
And then there was an outside pit, because I'm pretty sure, all I can remember, that it was a DX gas station.
I got a picture of that pit out there.
And then in 47, from what the lady gave me the paperwork on, they added this, and there's a pit outside, so he was inside working instead of being out in the weather.
Yeah, Herschel Arvin built the bay, the mechanics bay out there on it, and he was running it strong when I came here in '76. He done a lot of mechanic work, sold gas. Herschel stayed busy every day.
And whistled like a songbird.
That's right. He whistled and sang and such, and I really missed him when he was gone.
So then I ended up meeting Alfred through the neighbors over here that trim and do grooming of dogs. And I said, man, that is a cool gas station over there, because they're hard to they're hard to find anymore. And for 20 years I've been cleaning old facilities and businesses and everything else. And I said, boy, it'd be neat to have something like that. And then 2 days later, I think we met up, and about 4 days later, we had an agreement. And it just transpired after that, because I want to keep the history going and the old school going, and instead of people being on their telephones and stuff like this, it brings it back to when we were kids and everything else, where you sit and actually have conversation with people,
Right.
and communicate face to face instead of being on a phone.
Yeah.
And you learn a lot of history and life stories by being in personal reactions than, you know, being on a phone or whatever else. So
Right.
I just want to carry that dream on, because it's such an old school memory for me. And so we've done a lot of stuff to it, and we got a lot more work to go. We're hoping here in the next couple of years it'll be bigger and better, and put Alfordsville back on the map again, and make people proud in this town, you know.
Right.
I mean, what we're going to do down the road, we're hoping to have like maybe some food. We're going to do some carry-outs and stuff like this down the road, from sandwiches to possibly pizzas, stuff, and get other people involved. We're also going to be renting boats out here that people can rent and take to Glendale or to the river. We're talking about getting some kayaks if kids want to come out and take them to Glendale or the river and go kayaking and stuff, and just kind of bring it back more to where it's families again, instead of being on TV or in front of a TV or social media or whatever else. You know, it's the way I grew up and the way he grew up, and it was all about families and going outside and enjoying the outdoors, you know. So that's what we're working on.
That concludes today's virtual field trip. We hope you've enjoyed your visits to a few of Daviess County's most notable historic places. If you want to learn more about our local history, you can visit the Daviess County Museum at 212 East Main Street in Washington. There is no entry fee, and there are many exhibits and resources telling the stories of our ancestors here in Daviess County. We would like to leave you today with this message. Remember that history is not just the things of the past. History is being made every day. The things you are doing now and the decisions you will be making are the things your children and grandchildren will one day be studying as their history. What do you think you will be remembered for? Thank you for watching, and goodbye for now.